They thought first class was about money, status, and appearances, but in less than 10 minutes, they were about to learn it was about something far more dangerous: power. The cabin lights glowed softly over polished leather seats as passengers settled into their spacious rows, champagne flutes clinking gently, the low hum of quiet conversations filling the air. Everything about this space whispered exclusivity, a world designed for those who believe they belonged above everyone else. And then she walked in. Emily Carter stepped into the aisle wearing a simple beige sweater, dark jeans, and worn white sneakers, her hair loosely tied back, her presence calm, almost invisible. For a brief moment, no one reacted. Then the glances began. Subtle at first, sideways looks, raised eyebrows, a pause mid-sentence. Then came the whispers, low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. A man in a tailored navy suit leaned toward the woman beside him, his lips curling slightly as his eyes traced Emily from head to toe. Across the aisle, a group of passengers exchanged amused smirks, their designer watches catching the overhead light as they shifted in their seats. Emily didn't rush. She moved with quiet intention, her hand lightly brushing the top of each seat as she made her way deeper into the cabin, as if she had walked this path many times before. But to them, she didn't fit. And in a place like this, not fitting in was a crime no one forgave. Victoria Hayes noticed her next. Seated near the center of the cabin, draped in a silk blouse and gold jewelry that spoke louder than her voice ever needed to. Victoria paused mid-sip of her champagne. Her eyes narrowed, not with curiosity, but with judgment already fully formed. She tilted her head slightly, studying Emily like an out-of-place detail in an otherwise perfect painting. A faint laugh escaped her lips, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, and just quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant to. "This should be interesting," she murmured, her voice smooth with quiet amusement. Around her, a few passengers leaned in, drawn not by Emily, but by the promise of entertainment. The air shifted. What had been a calm, controlled environment now carried an undercurrent of expectation, the kind that builds when a room senses something, or someone, about to be tested. Emily reached her row and paused, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. She placed her small carry-on gently into the overhead bin, taking her time, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, by the growing attention behind her. The whispers grew louder now, no longer bothering to hide. A soft chuckle here, a dismissive glance there. Someone cleared their throat in exaggerated disbelief. The message was clear, even if no one had said it out loud yet. She doesn't belong here. And yet, she remained, unshaken, unbothered, as if she knew something they didn't, as if the room they thought they controlled was about to turn against them. And somewhere beyond the cabin door, a man was about to step in who would change everything. The seat number above Emily's head glowed softly in a pale blue light, unmistakable and indisputable, yet the tension in the air suggested that proof alone would not be enough here. As she settled into the wide leather seat, fastening her seatbelt with calm precision, a flight attendant paused a few steps away, her smile professional but strained, as if caught between protocol and pressure. She glanced toward Victoria Hayes, who gave the slightest nod, barely noticeable to anyone who was not watching closely, but powerful enough to shift the entire dynamic of the cabin. The attendant approached Emily with measured steps, her heels clicking quietly against the polished aisle floor. "Ma'am," she began, her tone polite but carrying a hint of uncertainty. "May I please see your boarding pass again?" The request hung in the air longer than it should have. Several nearby passengers turned their heads, their interest no longer subtle. Emily looked up slowly, her expression steady, her eyes meeting the attendant's without resistance. "Of course," she said, her voice soft but clear, as she reached into her bag and handed over the neatly folded pass. The attendant examined it carefully, longer than necessary, her brows knitting together slightly, as if searching for something that was not there. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the cabin, a faint chuckle broke through, followed by another. Victoria leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. "You know," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry, "these upgrades can be confusing for some people. It happens." A few passengers nodded in agreement, their amusement now openly displayed. The attendant hesitated, then looked back at Emily. "There seems to be no issue with your ticket," she admitted, though her tone lacked conviction, as if she expected the situation to resolve itself differently. But Victoria was not finished. "No issue," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Then perhaps there is a misunderstanding about standards." The words were sharp, coated in politeness, but unmistakably dismissive. The cabin grew quieter, the kind of silence that builds when people are waiting for someone to be put in their place. Emily took her boarding pass back gently, placing it on her lap. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Instead, she simply looked out the window for a brief moment, as if considering something far beyond the conversation unfolding around her. That calmness only fueled the tension further. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, caught between the validation of the ticket and the unspoken expectations of the passengers who clearly believed they had authority over the situation. "Ma'am," she said again, this time more cautiously, "if there is any concern, we can certainly review seating arrangements before departure." It was not a direct accusation, but it was close enough. A subtle suggestion that perhaps Emily should move for the comfort of others. The message landed exactly as intended. Victoria let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as if the outcome were inevitable. "That might be best," she added smoothly. "We all paid for a certain experience." The phrase lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, eyes remained fixed, waiting, judging, anticipating compliance. Emily finally turned back, her gaze calm, unwavering, almost impossibly composed. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and spoke with quiet certainty. "I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be." For a moment, no one responded. The words were simple, but they did not carry the hesitation everyone expected. They carried something else, something steady, something unshakable. And in that stillness, the room shifted ever so slightly, though no one yet understood why. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop without anyone adjusting the controls, a subtle shift that came not from the air system, but from the growing tension threading through every seat, every glance, every unspoken judgment. Victoria Hayes leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest as she studied Emily with a sharper focus now, no longer amused but faintly irritated by the lack of compliance. She had expected hesitation, perhaps embarrassment, maybe even an apology, but what she received instead was stillness, and that stillness unsettled her more than any argument could have. "Confidence is admirable," Victoria said slowly, her voice smooth but edged with condescension. "But there is a difference between confidence and misunderstanding your place." A few passengers nearby nodded subtly, encouraged by her tone, as if she had voiced what they were all thinking but preferred not to say aloud. The flight attendant shifted again, glancing toward the front of the cabin, clearly searching for guidance that was not coming quickly enough. The delay only amplified the discomfort, stretching the moment into something heavier, more public. "Ma'am," the attendant said carefully, her voice quieter now, but firmer, "we want to ensure that all of our passengers feel comfortable during the flight." The statement sounded neutral, but its direction was unmistakable. It was not Emily's comfort that was in question. Emily remained seated, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly, her eyes steady. She did not look at Victoria this time. She looked at the attendant, and there was something in her gaze that was not defensive, not confrontational, but quietly resolute. "I understand," she replied, her tone even, "and I am comfortable right here." The words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then a man across the aisle let out a soft scoff, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. "This is exactly the problem," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "People pushing boundaries where they do not belong." The phrase lingered, echoing softly through the cabin. Victoria exhaled slowly, her patience thinning. "We are not asking for much," she said, her voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Just a standard. That is what this section represents." She gestured lightly around the cabin, as if the leather seats, the wide spacing, the quiet luxury itself validated her claim. Emily's gaze flickered briefly across the space, taking in the polished surfaces, the curated comfort, the carefully maintained illusion of superiority. Then she looked back, her expression unchanged. "Standards are important," she said softly, but they are not always what people assume. That was when the tension broke into something more visible. A ripple of discomfort moved through the passengers, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, without hesitation, without apology, without any sign of retreat. The attendant took a small step back, as if instinctively creating distance from the center of the conflict. The situation was no longer simple. It was no longer just about a seat. It had become something else entirely, something harder to control. Victoria's smile returned, but it was thinner now, less certain. "Then perhaps we need someone with more authority to clarify things," she said, her voice cool as she glanced toward the cabin door. And as if the moment had been waiting for that exact cue, a faint sound echoed from the front of the aircraft, the door opening once more. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Footsteps followed, measured and deliberate, carrying a presence that did not need to announce itself. And in that instant, before anyone had even seen who it was, the air shifted again, quieter this time, heavier, as if the balance of the entire room was about to change. The sound of those footsteps did not rush, did not echo loudly, yet somehow they commanded attention more effectively than any raised voice ever could, and one by one, conversations faded into silence as heads turned toward the front of the cabin. The flight attendant straightened almost instantly, her posture shifting from uncertainty to alert composure, as if her instincts recognized authority before her eyes fully confirmed it. Then he appeared. Daniel Carter stepped into view with quiet precision, dressed in a dark tailored suit that carried no need for exaggeration, his presence calm but unmistakably commanding, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but received it anyway. His gaze moved across the cabin once, not hurried, not searching, but assessing, as if every detail registered without effort. The subtle shift was immediate. A man near the aisle lowered his glass mid-sip. Another passenger adjusted his posture without realizing it. Even Victoria's confident composure tightened for a fraction of a second before she regained her expression. Daniel did not speak at first. He walked forward slowly, his steps measured, his eyes finally settling on Emily. And in that single moment, something unspoken passed between them, something steady, familiar, grounded in a connection that required no explanation. Emily did not smile. She did not wave. She simply met his gaze with the same quiet calm she had held since the beginning. The attendant stepped forward quickly, her voice now noticeably different, sharper with professionalism. "Sir, welcome aboard," she said, her tone respectful, almost careful. "We were just resolving a small seating concern." Daniel's eyes shifted to her, not unkind, but direct. "A concern?" he repeated, his voice low, even, yet carrying clearly through the silent cabin. The words did not sound accusatory, but they did not need to. The attendant hesitated, her confidence faltering under the weight of his presence. "There appears to be some confusion regarding seating expectations in this section," she explained, choosing her words with visible caution. Daniel's gaze moved slowly from the attendant to Victoria, who sat upright now, her expression composed, but her earlier ease noticeably diminished. He did not acknowledge her directly, but the brief pause of his eyes was enough to make her shift slightly in her seat. Then he looked back at Emily. "Is there a problem with your seat?" he asked. The question was simple, but it landed like a turning point. Emily's voice remained steady. "No," she replied softly, "there is not." The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer filled with judgment. It was filled with anticipation. Daniel nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, as if confirming something already known. He turned back to the attendant, his expression composed, his tone still calm. "Then I trust everything is in order." It was not a question. It was a statement that left little room for interpretation. The attendant straightened further, her earlier hesitation replaced with immediate clarity. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "Everything is in order." Across the aisle, the man who had scoffed earlier looked down, suddenly very interested in adjusting his watch. Another passenger shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact altogether. The ripple of confidence that had once supported Victoria now seemed to dissolve, leaving her momentarily isolated in a space that no longer felt as controlled as it had minutes before. She cleared her throat softly, attempting to regain composure, but something had changed, something irreversible. And as Daniel remained standing there, calm, composed, and entirely in control without raising his voice even once. The room began to understand that whatever they thought they knew about power, they had just been mistaken. Victoria Hayes had built her entire sense of certainty on a simple assumption, that power could be recognized instantly by appearance, by tone, by who spoke first and who stayed quiet. But now, sitting in the same seat she had occupied with effortless confidence just minutes earlier, she felt that assumption begin to unravel piece by piece. She straightened her posture, smoothing an invisible crease from her blouse as she forced a small, controlled smile, the kind designed to regain control without admitting any loss of it. "I am sure there has been some misunderstanding," she said carefully, her voice measured but no longer as fluid as before. Her eyes briefly met Daniel's. Searching, calculating, attempting to place him within the hierarchy she believed she understood. But Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Emily, his attention grounded entirely in her presence, as if the rest of the cabin existed only in the background. "Did anyone ask you to move?" he asked quietly. Emily paused for just a fraction of a second, not because she needed to think, but because the weight of the question carried more than its words. "They suggested it," she answered calmly. The simplicity of her response did more than any accusation could have. It did not exaggerate. It did not defend. It simply revealed. Daniel's expression did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened, something subtle yet unmistakable. He shifted his gaze back toward the attendant, who now stood straighter than before, her earlier hesitation replaced by a careful awareness of every word she chose. "We want all passengers to feel comfortable," she repeated softly, though the sentence now sounded different, stripped of the authority it had carried earlier. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting its implication. "Comfort should not depend on assumptions," he replied evenly. The words settled into the space between them, not raised, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. Around them, the cabin remained silent, the earlier murmurs completely gone, replaced by a quiet tension that held everyone in place. The man who had spoken earlier avoided looking up entirely now, his focus fixed on the window, as if the clouds outside suddenly required his full attention. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably, crossing and uncrossing his legs without realizing it. The dynamic had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Victoria inhaled slowly, her composure tightening as she realized the ground beneath her confidence was no longer stable. "We were simply maintaining the standard of the cabin," she said, her voice softer now, less certain, as if testing whether the argument still held weight. Daniel looked at her for the first time directly, his expression calm, his gaze steady, not confrontational, but deeply precise. "Standards matter," he said, his tone measured, "but they begin with how people are treated." The sentence was quiet, yet it carried a clarity that cut through the space more effectively than any raised voice could have. Victoria's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. The certainty she had relied on moments ago no longer felt as solid. The authority she thought she represented no longer felt recognized. The room, once aligned with her, now seemed to exist in a different balance entirely. And in that stillness, with no announcement, no explanation, and no need for either, the truth settled into place for everyone watching. The man standing in front of them was not just another passenger. And whatever power they thought came with a seat, it did not belong to them anymore. The silence that settled over the cabin was no longer uncertain or curious. It was absolute, the kind that forms when a realization begins to take shape but has not yet been spoken out loud. And in that silence, every small movement seemed louder than it should have been. The faint rustle of fabric, the soft clink of a glass being set down, the subtle shift of someone adjusting in their seat, as if trying to disappear into it. Daniel Carter remained standing, his posture relaxed yet immovable, his presence anchoring the entire space without effort. He did not raise his voice, he did not demand attention, and yet every eye remained fixed on him, waiting, watching, recalibrating everything they thought they understood just minutes ago. The flight attendant swallowed lightly, her earlier confidence replaced with a careful attentiveness that bordered on unease. "Sir," she said, choosing her words with precision, "if there has been any inconvenience, we sincerely apologize." The apology was directed toward Emily, but her eyes remained on Daniel, as if seeking confirmation that it was enough. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Emily once more, his expression softening slightly in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them. "Were you inconvenienced?" he asked her quietly. Emily considered the question for a brief moment, not because she needed to search for an answer, but because she understood the weight behind it. "No," she replied calmly. "I am fine." The simplicity of her response carried more dignity than any complaint ever could, and for a moment, it seemed to settle the situation. But Daniel's gaze shifted again, this time slowly sweeping across the cabin, taking in every face, every avoided glance, every trace of discomfort that had replaced earlier confidence. "Good," he said softly. Then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, he added, "Because no one should feel out of place on a seat they have rightfully been given." The statement was not directed at anyone specific, yet it reached everyone. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest, the polished composure she had maintained beginning to fracture at the edges. She inhaled as if preparing to speak, to reclaim some sense of authority, but the moment had shifted too far for that to be possible. Still, she tried. "We were simply trying to ensure that the experience remained consistent," she said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Daniel turned his attention to her again, his gaze steady, not harsh, but unmistakably clear. "Consistency should never come at the cost of respect," he replied. The words were delivered evenly, without emphasis, yet they landed with undeniable weight. The cabin remained still, absorbing the shift not as a confrontation, but as a correction. A quiet one, but complete. The man across the aisle who had spoken earlier now looked down entirely, his reflection faintly visible in the window, as if he preferred to face that rather than the moment unfolding in front of him. Another passenger cleared his throat softly, the sound awkward against the silence, then quickly looked away. The flight attendant nodded, her posture now fully aligned with Daniel's presence rather than the expectations that had guided her before. "Understood, sir," she said. And for the first time since Emily had stepped into the cabin, the tension began to release, not because anyone had won, but because something deeper had been restored. The illusion that status alone defined belonging had quietly dissolved, replaced by a truth that no one in that room could ignore anymore. And as Daniel remained there, composed and unwavering, the realization continued to settle in, slow but undeniable. The power in that cabin had never belonged to the loudest voice, the finest clothing, or the most expensive seat. It had always belonged to something else entirely. And now, everyone could see it. Victoria Hayes had never been the kind of person to lose control of a situation, especially not in a room where she had always felt superior without needing to prove it. But now, sitting there under the quiet weight of shifting attention, she felt something unfamiliar settle in, not fear, but exposure, as if the invisible structure that once elevated her had been removed without warning. She adjusted her posture again, slower this time, more deliberate, as though reclaiming control required effort now. "I believe this has been taken out of context," she said carefully, her voice softer, her words chosen with precision, no longer designed to dominate but to recover. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the other passengers, searching for reinforcement, but none came. The same individuals who had once leaned into her remarks now avoided her gaze entirely, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet detachment. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch just long enough for the absence of support around her to become unmistakable. Then he spoke, his voice even, steady, and entirely unhurried. "Context matters," he said, "but so does intention." The words were simple, but they carried a clarity that left little room for interpretation. Victoria opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again, the response she had prepared no longer fitting the moment. The shift had gone too far. The narrative she had controlled had already slipped beyond her reach. The flight attendant stepped forward once more, her posture now fully aligned with the new balance in the room. "Ms. Carter," she said respectfully, her tone noticeably different from earlier. "If there is anything you need during the flight, please let us know. We are here to ensure your comfort." The acknowledgement was subtle, but it was public, and that made all the difference. Emily looked up, her expression unchanged, her voice calm as ever. "Thank you," she replied simply. She did not demand more. She did not extend the moment. She allowed it to settle exactly as it was. Daniel watched her for a brief moment, then nodded slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but not by those paying attention. He turned slightly, preparing to step away, but paused just long enough to address the space once more without raising his voice. "A seat does not define a person," he said, his tone measured, "but how you treat someone in that seat always will." The statement lingered, quiet but undeniable, embedding itself into the silence that followed. No one moved. No one spoke. The lesson did not need to be repeated. It had already taken hold. Victoria lowered her gaze for the first time, her earlier composure replaced with something far less certain. The room she had once controlled now felt distant, unfamiliar, as if it no longer recognized her in the same way. Around her, the cabin began to breathe again, slowly returning to motion, but not to what it had been before. Something had shifted, something subtle but permanent. And as Daniel finally stepped back toward the front of the aircraft, his presence receding but his impact remaining, the truth settled fully into place for everyone watching. The difference between status and character was no longer abstract. It had just been demonstrated, quietly, completely, and without a single raised voice. The cabin slowly returned to motion, but it was not the same motion as before, not the effortless rhythm of quiet confidence and subtle superiority, but something more restrained, more aware, as if every person seated there had become conscious of being watched, not by others, but by their own reflection in the moment that had just unfolded. The soft hum of the aircraft systems filled the space again, blending with the faint clink of glasses and the muted rustle of fabric, yet beneath it all lingered a silence that had not fully left. Emily Carter adjusted slightly in her seat, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged, as though nothing significant had occurred, as though the entire shift in the room had been nothing more than a passing moment. But for everyone else, it was not so easily dismissed. The flight attendant returned quietly, her posture composed, her tone now carrying a level of sincerity that had not been present before. "Ms. Carter," she said gently, "may I offer you something to drink before we depart?" There was no hesitation in her voice now, no uncertainty, only respect. Emily looked up briefly, offering a small, polite nod. "Water would be perfect, thank you." The simplicity of her request contrasted sharply with the weight of what had just taken place, and somehow, that made it even more powerful. Across the aisle, the man who had earlier made dismissive remarks now sat still, his attention fixed forward, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet discomfort he could not easily hide. He adjusted his sleeve, then his watch, small movements that revealed more than words ever could. Nearby, another passenger shifted slightly, glancing once toward Emily before quickly looking away, as if acknowledging her presence now required a different kind of awareness. Victoria Hayes remained seated, her posture composed, but her energy noticeably altered. The effortless ease she had once carried was gone, replaced by a careful stillness, the kind that comes when someone is no longer certain of their position in the room. She picked up her glass, then set it down again without taking a sip, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, replaying moments she could not undo. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Emily, then away again, as if unsure whether acknowledgement would help or only deepen the realization settling around her. The subtle hierarchy that had once defined the cabin had dissolved, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And in its place, something quieter had taken hold, something grounded not in appearance or assumption, but in the undeniable clarity of what had just been revealed. At the front of the cabin, Daniel Carter spoke briefly with a member of the crew, his voice low, his posture relaxed, as if the situation had never required anything more than presence. He did not look back immediately. He did not seek recognition, and yet his influence remained woven into the atmosphere, steady and unmistakable. When he finally turned, his eyes met Emily's once more, and there was a quiet understanding there, something unspoken yet complete. No words were needed. The engines outside began to rise in pitch as the aircraft prepared for departure, the sound building gradually, filling the space with a steady vibration that grounded everyone back into the present moment. Seatbelt signs illuminated overhead, casting a soft glow that reflected off polished surfaces and still faces. And as the plane began to move, rolling slowly along the runway, the lesson that had unfolded moments earlier remained suspended in the air, not fading, not forgotten, but carried forward with them, a silent reminder that would stay long after the flight had reached its destination. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the runway, the subtle pressure pressing passengers gently into their seats as the city below began to shrink into patterns of light and shadow. But inside the cabin, something far more significant had already taken place, something that would not fade with altitude or time. The soft chimes signaling ascent echoed briefly, followed by the captain's voice welcoming everyone on board, steady and routine, as if this were just another ordinary flight. Yet for those seated in that first-class cabin, nothing about this moment felt ordinary anymore. Emily Carter sat quietly, her gaze drifting toward the window as clouds stretched endlessly beyond the glass, her reflection faint but steady, unchanged from the moment she had first stepped into the aisle. There was no trace of triumph in her expression, no need to revisit what had happened, only a calm presence that seemed untouched by the judgment that had once surrounded her. Across the aisle, the passengers who had once measured her worth in seconds now carried a different weight, one that settled deeper than embarrassment, something closer to realization. The man who had spoken earlier finally glanced toward Emily again, but this time his expression held no superiority, only a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. He looked away quickly, not out of dismissal, but out of reflection. Victoria Hayes remained still, her posture composed but no longer performative, her earlier certainty replaced by a silence that felt more honest than anything she had said before. Her gaze rested forward, unfocused, as if replaying the moment when everything she believed about status had quietly unraveled. She did not speak again. She did not attempt to reclaim the space she had once controlled. Some lessons, once understood, do not need to be debated. At the front of the cabin, Daniel Carter returned to his seat beside Emily, his movements as calm as they had been from the beginning. He sat down without ceremony, without drawing attention, as though his presence had never required explanation in the first place. For a brief moment, their hands rested close, not touching, but connected in a way that required no gesture. He looked at her, his expression softening just slightly, and she returned the look with the same quiet understanding. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The cabin continued its gentle rhythm as the flight progressed. Drinks were served, conversations resumed in softer tones, and the polished world of first class slowly rebuilt itself, but not in the same way it had before. There was a subtle shift now, something quieter, something more aware. The illusion that appearance alone defined belonging had been replaced by something far more enduring. And as the aircraft moved steadily through the sky, carrying everyone toward their destination, the lesson remained, not spoken aloud, but present in every glance, every pause, every moment of reflection. Because that day, in a place where status was once measured by seats and silence, the truth had revealed itself without force, without spectacle, and without apology. And in that quiet revelation, the room had finally learned what dignity looks like.